Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. A new Indigenous-led emergency alert system has been announced for the James Smith Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. The announcement comes just 2 weeks after a coroner's inquest into the mass stabbings on the nation and nearby Weldon. 29 recommendations were made to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future, including implementing a public safety strategy. Our reporter Rachel May has more.
On Wednesday, James Smith Cree Nation unveiled a new way to communicate emergency alerts to band members and those in the local area. A new feature on the Talking Stick app called First Alerts, which is now up and running, will allow leadership in First Nations communities across Saskatchewan to share vital information about emergency events as they unfold to members of the community, such as missing people, natural disasters, and public safety. The First Alerts app is also designed as an emergency alerts app by Apple, which means that users will receive an emergency notification to their phones, even if they're on silent or in airplane mode. Chief Robert Head of Peter Chapman Band, one of the 3 bands that makes up James Smith Cree Nation, said this tool can save lives.
That'll be a great way for us to have advance warnings for natural disasters, for missing persons, or for any kind of public safety event that's immediately happening that needs, to be broadcast to the membership.
Head was joined by staff from Tricycle Data, the developers of the Talking Stick app. Talking Stick gives First Nations members across Saskatchewan access to peer supports from First Nations people, regardless of where they are. Cecile McKay, the provincial director for the Talking Stick app, says she's glad to add this new emergency alerts feature and encourages individuals to reach out to their peer support workers during stressful times.
Just know that it's someone like you and me. We're there to just help you along, guide you.
The app can now be used on any First Nation across Saskatchewan and is now available on the App Store for both Apple and Android users. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew announced funding to improve Manitoba's healthcare system today. The federal government is pledging $633 million to help with emergency wait times, long-term care for seniors, and to hire more healthcare professionals. The goal for Manitoba is to be able to hire more physicians, nurses, paramedics, and home care workers. Both governments say they will also work with Indigenous peoples to address gaps and systemic inequalities in Indigenous healthcare.
There are some real challenges facing our health systems right now. It can be too hard to access a family doctor or a nurse practitioner. Emergency rooms are too often overwhelmed. People are waiting for the surgeries they need, and healthcare workers are under immense pressure, working in conditions that make it even harder to be there for their patients.
We're going to ensure that you can access health care in the north, that you can access health care on reserve, that you can access health care here in the city of Winnipeg just as readily as you can in rural Manitoba.
Still in Winnipeg, on Wednesday night, the annual Memorial March in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people gave space to grieving families, thinking of their lost loved ones. Though always full of emotion, this year's march took place just days after the deaths of a Manitoba woman, her 3 children, and her teenage niece. Marchers sang for their missing or murdered loved ones throughout the city's downtown. Around 400 people poured through the streets in a sea of red to Manitoba's Legislative Building. The annual march took place just days after 5 people, including 3 children, were found dead near the town of Carman, an hour southwest of Winnipeg. Event organizer Alea McIver says the tragic deaths had an impact on the event.
Every day should be more important, and how we can do better, right? And how we can action better, and how we can really move the narrative into actioning those 231 calls to action. Therefore, what's recently transpired in Carman, for example, really pushed us to look deeper within ourselves as a committee and how we can respond to that, because there was young lives lost, right?
Quebec Superior Judge authorized a class action on behalf of day school survivors who attended provincially run institutions this past December. The victims alleged that they suffered physical, psychological, and sexual abuse at the hands of teachers, administrators, and employees. Those who attended those schools are hoping for justice. A warning, some viewers may find details in this story upsetting. Here's Maricel Amador with that report.
C'est là qu'on était toutes en position karaté, là, qui appelle en punition.
Adrienne Jérôme, a former chief from Lac-Simon, was a little girl when she attended day school on the reserve. The school, still standing today, serves as a constant reminder of the abuse she and many other children in Lac-Simon endured for years.
Quand j'étais plus petite, là, je tremblais, là. Il fallait être comme dans l'armée. C'était pas tout droite, là. Tu te fais raser, ramasser.
Jérôme is part of a class action that is seeking compensation for survivors who allege that abuse was rampant at day schools in Quebec. It includes victims who attended provincial, public, or religious schools between 1951 and 2014, or in an Inuit village from 1963 to 1978.
Fallait que tu dises oui, ou bien non. Si tu dis Kawin, tu te faisais ramasser. Juste des petits mots de même. T'imagines-tu, personne ne voulait parler, personne ne voulait rien dire en Algonquin. Puis c'était notre seule langue.
Her experience echoes that of many other survivors in Lac-Simon, who have now decided to tell their story.
Il passait son temps à tirer les oreilles.
On nous tirait par les cheveux.
Il nous tournait tout le temps les oreilles. Même il nous pinçait avec des élastiques.
The survivors recounted that the abuse first started when they attended a school in Louiscourt, located a few kilometers away from the community.
Et nous autres, on nous frappait à l'école avec ces règles-là.
Les règles qui étaient en bois en plus. T'as assez peur.
Ça, c'est où que les enfants de Kitsaki qui étaient gardés là, pour l'école.
The day school was then relocated to Lac-Simon. Today, it is called Améquich School.
Dès l'âge de 8 ans qu'ils ont commencé à nous faire des choses comme la violence physique, verbale ou psychologique. Parce qu'on nous traitait comme des enfants sauvages sans pas de cervelle. Mais je dois dire aujourd'hui quand même ce que j'ai subi d'elle. Il a touché une partie de mon sexe.
Papatsi, like the others, said that the abuse got so bad that many of the children would purposely act out to avoid going to school.
Il m'a amené dans un coin en me mettant en punition parce que j'ai pas écouté. Je voulais pas aller à l'école. Je voulais rien savoir de l'école parce qu'on subissait des choses. Il me mettait en punition de karaté dans un coin avec des roches aux genoux pour que je comprenne à sa façon.
Some of the children resorted to sniffing gas in order to get through the days. The trauma affected their behavior. Jérôme said that she became violent.
J'étais devenue dangereuse.
Je suis venue délinquante.
Les filles me battaient. J'ai frappé une fille avec une roche dans sa face.
On a commencé, nous autres, à vandaliser l'école.
Puis là, il y avait plein de sang. Tout le monde me tirait les cheveux.
The survivors said that non-Indigenous children also attended the school.
On ne voulait plus rien savoir des Blancs.
And they would bully and also beat the Indigenous students.
C'était juste nous autres, les Algonquins, qu'on se faisait toujours frapper. Ils nous traitaient de caouches à tous les jours.
The school ended up shutting down for a period of time after it was completely ransacked by some of the children.
On cherchait un moyen pour que ça ferme.
But unfortunately, following the incident, the survivors were transferred to the church's basement where the abuse continued.
Le prêtre qui nous faisait subir toutes les caresses ou bien les frottements avec sa barre, tout ça, puis ça restait gravé entre nous.
After leaving day school, many of the survivors ended up falling into drugs and alcohol to cope with the trauma. Most refused to go back to school altogether.
Pourquoi je ne vais plus à l'école? C'est à cause de ça. Je peux retourner à l'école après.
They never completed high school. Papatsi said that the class action is a step in the right direction.
Je trouve que c'est bien parce que ça va péter une bulle, une guérison, le cheminement qu'on va faire, nous autres, les survivants.
But it will never erase all of the suffering that went on in those schools.
Le gouvernement, il pense tout le temps qu'ils vont l'oublier, on va donner l'argent. C'est pas ça.
Nous autres, on a été comme une jeunesse qui a été comme traumatisée. Mon fils, C'est comme une jeunesse, comme on dirait qu'on a scrappé aussi, là. Mais l'autre génération, là, on est en train de le scraper, là aussi, là. Puis il faut se relever, là, tout de suite, là.
The Montreal law firm Dion Schulz is representing the survivors. In a written statement, they said, the class action has officially passed the first stage, with the possible exception of one of the school boards. It is the James Bay School Board, which is attempting to remove itself as one of the defendants in the class action. The Court of Appeal will hear the application on February 15th. This appeal may slow down proceedings for the entire class action, but will not stop it completely. Maricela Amador, APTN National News, Lac-Simon, Quebec.
If you need additional support today or anytime, you can call the Hope for Wellness helpline 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for counseling or crisis intervention. The number is 1-855-242-3310, or you can connect to the online chat. That's at www.hopeforwellness.ca and follow the links. Time for a quick break. Coming up, our Truth and Politics panel weighs in on the recent Supreme Court of Canada ruling on child welfare. Stick around. Welcome back. It was a much celebrated unanimous decision by the Supreme Court of Canada last week. The court killed a constitutional challenge by Quebec over Bill C-92, a federal law that recognizes First Nation, Inuit, and Métis jurisdiction over children, youth, and families. For more on this, we're joined by our Truth and Politics panel. Carrie Benjo is the editor of Eagle Feather News, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press and with the University of Manitoba. Carrie, Niigaan, thanks for being with us. Niigaan, starting with you, why would Quebec challenge this right to have control over the children in our communities? Why is this a significant ruling?
Well, there's three main reasons. One is the provinces continue to see us as a revenue source, and when we get control over the lives of our children, they lose that revenue, particularly from the federal government. The second is that it's a jurisdiction issue. They see that First Nations governments aren't real governments, and that dealing with them more like municipalities or just not governments at all. And then the third issue is that there is an ongoing misunderstanding by the provinces, that's my optimistic word, to want to quash, ignore Indigenous rights. We see this in Saskatchewan, particularly a little bit in the previous government here in Manitoba, absolutely in Alberta and Ontario. But the real challenge is Indigenous rights when it comes to Quebec. You know, when Quebec wants to argue for it having special status under the Constitution, it doesn't. Going all the way back to the constitutional talks in Meech Lake, Charlottetown, it's not in the interest of Quebec for Indigenous peoples to continue to talk about their rights and have them recognized by the federal government.
We'll pick up on that in a second here, but Carrie, how do you think this decision will affect Indigenous children, especially those in provincial care?
I think right now we're not going to see a significant change because in order for, First Nations to take control, they need to have the space to bring the children home if ideally that's what they want. And when there's such a housing shortage on reserve and a lack of infrastructure, many First Nations don't have the capacity to bring the children home. But what this legislation does is it gives them the means in which to do so. Now they can work towards, building whatever they need necessary to bring their children home. And I think ideally that's what every First Nation person wants, is to have, be able to come back to the community, be able to rely on their family, their extended family, those resources to help raise their children and move back to that traditional child upbringing that, is so ingrained in our culture.
Now, Niigaan, you mentioned Quebec there, and they said that their argument was never with Indigenous peoples, but with the federal government. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, that's exactly my point, is that Quebec continues to want to have special status under the Constitution going back all the way to Confederation, really, 150 plus years. And Quebec, by wanting those special status, particularly for language and culture, but then also the other bigger issues around land and resources, Quebec is not in the business of trying to have Indigenous peoples articulate and have our rights affirmed. And continually, Quebec wants to resist that and to have it recognized by the federal government, not just in C-92. I mean, that's just a step in a much larger process. C-15, bringing Canadian law in concert with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is really a nightmare for Quebec in wanting to articulate bigger control and even the issue of sovereignty. I mean, we think back to the days of Lucien Bouchard and saying we're going to separate from Canada, and First Nations going, we have a choice on who we will join, Canada or you, in that new endeavor, and going, Quebec doesn't want that kind of conversation to really gain any momentum.
Kerry, do you think that this decision means that the Supreme Court of Canada might be more willing to accept that Indigenous peoples have inherent rights, not just over child and family issues, but maybe other big issues such as control of natural resources?
Definitely. I see this as a positive move forward. I think when we go back to the signing of treaties, one of the things that was mentioned was learning the cunning of the white man. And I always come back to this. Cunning of the white man doesn't necessarily just mean education. It means gaining that knowledge and that understanding of the institutions that created the system that we're in now. If we're not at those tables, where decisions are being made, policy is being enacted, then our voice is left out, and we don't have say on what is happening. But now we're in a space, in a place where we are at those tables. We have our first First Nations premier in Manitoba, so we are coming to the table. We are in all these spaces now, and it's so very hard to ignore us and put us aside, and we are using their laws to reaffirm what we have already always known.
Kerry and Egon, we'll leave it there, but appreciate you both taking the time again this week.
Yeah, much thanks.
For more on the Truth in Politics panel and to watch any or all of the previous 44 panels, you can visit our APTN News YouTube page. Time now for another quick break. Still to come, there is concern about the loss of a hockey team that's been an important pipeline for Indigenous players in northern Manitoba.
We're all Canadian, and this is something that we all grew up with, and it shouldn't be taken away from them.
Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. This beautiful, calming view of the snow-covered ice of where two rivers merge near Norway House Cree Nation in northern Manitoba. Looks like only one person's been out there to walk on it, and that's probably Christopher, who sent in the photo. Thanks for sending us that. If you have an awesome photo of the land, nature, family, or community, you can send that photo to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, -2 with snow in Halifax, cloudy and 3 below in Fredericton. -21 in Kuujjuaq, 12 below with snow in Nain. -1 with flurries in Montreal, 5 below and snow in Val-d'Or. -7 with flurries in Sault Ste. Marie, snow and 4 below in North Bay. -6 with snow in Thunder Bay, 16 below with snow in Sioux Lookout. -17 in God's Lake, 12 below and snow for Norway House. -12 in Winnipeg, 10 below in Dauphin. -9 for Regina, 8 below in Saskatoon. -6 in Meadow Lake, sunny, and -1 in Buffalo Narrows. Sun's out across northern Alberta, -1 in High Level, 2 below in Fort Chill. +1 in Edmonton, sunny, and -8 in Lethbridge. 8 above in Vancouver, 7 for Victoria. Sunny and -4 in Prince George and Smithers. -19 in Old Crow, 2 below in Rock River. -6 in Yellowknife, -8 in Wrigley. 12 below for Sax Harbor, -5 in Paulatuck. 30 below in Chesterfield and Whale Cove. minus 28 in Resolute, 30 below in Arctic Bay. Concerns about whether or not northern Manitoba will have, or whether or not northern Manitoba will have a AAA under-18 hockey team. Some people worried about an important Indigenous hockey pipeline. Our Trevor Wright has more.
The Manitoba U18 AAA League says they want to make themselves more competitive. They've set up a committee to do this, and reducing the number of teams is a potential option. There are currently 12 teams in the league. The Norman North Stars and Thompson could be on their way out, even though they've helped improve the careers of Indigenous hockey players from the region and southern Nunavut. This has led to an outcry from various hockey groups in the region. James Smith of APTN Cree Nation played with the North Stars in the 1980s. He went on to coach junior hockey for OCN and Pigwis.
I think it's a shame that it's come to this, that it's even an option and that it's even on the table, because it's hockey. I mean, we're all Canadian, and this is something that we all grew up with, and it shouldn't be taken away from them.
Andre Murphy is mayor of the Paw and coach of the Norman U15 AAA team based in that town. He says he's heard that the league is thinking about combining the Norman Parkland teams, the latter based in Dauphin. There have been concerns surrounding the potential for the Kenora Thistles in Ontario to be axed as well. He says that move would diminish local hockey.
I understand the rationale why they want to make a league more competitive and care about the top end players and all that sort of good stuff, but I also worry about the grassroots part of it and what the loss is in northern Manitoba and the impact on all of our communities up north there.
The North Stars have not responded to a request for comment. The Manitoba U18 AAA League declined to comment. Trevor Wright, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
Boy, the North Stars and the Thistles, iconic teams, would be a big loss. Over to our Ottawa studio now. That's where Fraser Needham is standing by with a look at tonight's episode of Nation to Nation.
Coming up after the news on Nation to Nation, Canada's housing advocate says the government needs to be aware that a disproportionate number of Indigenous people are now part of the country's growing homeless population. Also, Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May is here to talk about a new First Nations court challenge of a proposed nuclear waste facility near Ottawa. And Dalhousie University law professor Naomi Metallic explains why last week's Supreme Court decision on Canada's Indigenous Child Services Law should be seen as a positive step forward. All this and more ahead, so stay tuned.
Thanks, Fraser. You can watch Nation to Nation right here in about 90 seconds from now. That's all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Thursday. For much more, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward, Marcy Miigwech. Thanks for being with us. Stay tuned. Nation to Nation is next. Have a great night.